Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. You are joined by just Charly today, and you know what happens when they leave me in charge of all the controls and the microphones and the podcast recording. Yes, you are going to the 17th century, and I think you're going to like it. So I'm joined by a wonderful guest today. Amy Saunders has recently submitted a PhD examining the reconstruction of Stuart kings and queens in heritage sites. And she's been addressing such themes as patronage, sexuality, identity, colonialism, and conflict. So we're covering a wide range of stuff. So it goes without saying that we want her back to talk to us about the connection between modern heritage representations and the modern monarchy. Very, very much so. She's been published several times over on all of these themes and more, and we're very thrilled to have her with us today to discuss Catherine of Braganza. Charles II was her husband. Let's frame her like that. Hello, Amy.
Hi, Charly. It's great to be back.
It's really, really good to have you, and I'm really excited to talk about the Stuart Queens, especially Stuart Queens Consort. And to talk about Catherine of Braganza again. Now, when we sort of spoke, the two of us, and you said you wanted to talk about Catherine, there was a moment when I thought, well, actually, we've had Eilish Gregory on recently talking about Catherine of Braganza. Do we do another Catherine episode? And then I suddenly thought, how many times have we sat here on this podcast and talked about Anne Boleyn?
It's so true, and I feel like that is going to be one of my big points today. In comparison to their Tudor counterparts, the Stuart Queen Consorts get very little love in like books, in heritage, in fiction, in film. They are much less examined, but no less deserving of our attention.
Fantastic! It's a brilliant point to make. So, in our little intro, I mentioned that she was Charles II's wife. No, Charles II was her husband. I wanted to introduce her in her own right because the focus of your work has been on the representation of our Stuart Queens in modern heritage. If these women are represented at all in modern heritage, because they seem shockingly absent to me when I go round, how are they represented?
Yeah, so the Stuart Queen Consorts are really rarely presented in heritage sites, despite an amazing range of material culture that could be used to explore their lives that we know is in museum and heritage site collections. There's amazing portraits, there's loads of coinage, and there's fabulous things that could be on display. And you will often see portraits and objects from the period, especially if you're visiting like a National Trust house or an English heritage site. So if you go to Montacute House or if you go to Bolsover Castle, those sorts of places, very kind of lots of 17th century going on there. But the way the Queen Consorts themselves are interpreted in those places is often really oversimplified, and it fails to recognise their activities and their agency beyond their position as just being the wife of the king and their potential to produce an heir. So yeah, in my kind of PhD, I've looked at 3 Stuart Queen Consorts, and there are more, and there are people I know who are working on them. So I've been focusing on Anna of Denmark, who's wife of James VI and First, Henrietta Maria, who's wife of Charles I, and of course Catherine of Braganza, who's wife of Charles II. And I know we're going to focus on Catherine today, and obviously we've already mentioned Eilish's amazing previous podcast with you. So I'm going to try to not cover a lot of the biographical stuff because Eilish did a great job. But when we see them in heritage sites, they are really often either completely ignored, overshadowed, or just avoided. And this is kind of related to a whole load of different reasons. Their religion, their foreign identity, and then for Catherine, the fact that she doesn't have children, and both her and Henrietta Maria don't lead to the modern monarchy. And I think that has a really kind of strong kind of impact on how we represent them in heritage sites.
Gosh, I mean, if we have any knowledge of Catherine of Braganza at all, when we're going into a heritage site. So when we talk about heritage sites, we're talking about museums, castles, stately homes, these kind of lovely places where we go on our days off and have fun. If we've got any sort of prior knowledge of Catherine, it tends to be around her quote unquote failure to produce an heir to the throne, because obviously Charles II has no legitimate children with his queen. What challenges does a narrative like this present in a heritage setting?
So yeah, this is something I've become really kind of passionate about as I've been working through my research, and is one of the things that's kind of most angered me as I've been doing it. And I think, yeah, it's really important to say now that anytime we say failed or failure, we are putting air quotes around it. Yeah. And so, yeah, as you say, Catherine is largely remembered for being the queen who failed to have children, and was overshadowed by these glamorous, fabulous mistresses that everyone's really interested in and everyone wants to know about. And the suggestion that kind of Catherine was dull and traditional and a bit of a pushover, and Eilish did a great job of kind of ripping that to pieces in your last podcast, because Catherine was really engaged in patronage, was really interested in horticulture and the navy and all sorts of things, and her and Charles did have a relationship. It just isn't the relationship that people want to imagine for a royal couple. But yeah, in terms of presenting her as a woman who failed to have children in heritage sites, I think it's a really big problem, because 1 in 5 women in the UK experience a miscarriage, and 1 in 100 experience recurrent miscarriages, which is where you have 3 or more in a row. And Catherine had multiple miscarriages. So presenting the value of any historic woman as being tied entirely to their ability to produce children is not only misrepresentative of what was actually going on at the time, but also has the ability to affect the visitor in a huge variety of negative ways, because a lot of your visitors, both men and women, will be going through fertility difficulties and worries, and it places the, again, air quotes, blame only on Catherine. And this really removes the anxiety that both Charles and Catherine felt around fertility and around Catherine's pregnancies. And it just reinforces the idea that pregnancy, childbirth and child rearing are all things that are only connected to women, which is really damaging and not reflective of the royal couple themselves, or of how a lot of modern visitors view their own fertility journeys. And I really think we need to have a really good think of how, like nationally across the board, of how we present themes of parenthood and pregnancy in heritage sites, because it's just not done very well. And there's so many opportunities for kind of co-collaboration with different community groups and with different charities and things, to kind of bring that narrative out of the shadows and be like, this isn't something that's shameful or unusual, or it's a horrible thing that happens, but it will, most people will, like, a lot of people will experience it in some way, which I think is especially important, because I'm pretty sure this month is Miscarriage Awareness Month. So I feel like this is a very appropriate time to be talking about this.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and it's a troubling narrative that we are still, the fact that we're feeding this to people throughout all historical writing and historical sources, that it was the wife who failed, it was Catherine who failed, whereas all of the sort of fertility issues that Charles and Catherine were going through, and let's be realistic and pragmatic about this. Politically, they did need to have an heir. This is the most important function of the consort, is continuing the royal line. They were going through all of this in the 17th century, and they don't have the advantages that we have now. There may have been medical interventions that they could have had they been around now, but as a couple who desperately wanted children and couldn't have them, and we know a lot about Catherine and the stresses that she was put under. It is no wonder that woman could not, she probably wasn't in any position to conceive a child, because the stress and the pressure on her would have been immense.
Yeah, completely. And modern medicine has proven how important stress is in terms of being able to conceive a child. And I think one of the problems with often how we talk about Catherine is there's this, like, by basically saying she failed to have children, we're also ignoring that she did have those pregnancies and she did have those experiences, and that those experiences and that pain and the emotions she had in that period are just as important to her, in terms of kind of her own life kind of perception and narrative. And so by just saying, oh, she didn't have children, we're wiping off a whole kind of section of female experience that is kind of seen as, oh, this is too unclean to talk about. This is not what we should talk about in polite society. But it happens, as I said, to 1 in 5 people. Yeah. And so, I think to carry on presenting her in that way is just really, really damaging.
Yeah, I'm thinking about now later Stuart Queens, like Mary and Anne, both of whom had their own struggles with fertility, and Anne, someone that we've started perhaps thinking a bit more about, because we had the film The Favourite, which was obviously a huge success, and Olivia Colman's portrayal of the Queen, and how she handled the scale of loss that she had. I mean, it's almost easier to do in a setting like that, in a kind of artistic film, book, a story, a novel, in that sort of setting. But then when you've actually trying to bring that into heritage, it's a whole other challenge for you.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's not something that's going to be easy. But the same to be said about how more recently we've been addressing kind of narratives of colonialism and empire and gender and sexuality. Like 15 years ago, people thought that was, and it is still a process and we've still got a long way to go, but 15 years ago, people were kind of balking at the idea of, oh gosh, this is going to be really hard. How are we going to do it? And it's all about research and time and funding. And so the same goes with this. It's not going to happen overnight, but we at least need to be thinking about it.
Amazing. Okay, so let's move the conversation on and look at some of the other Queens Consort. Let's look at and we're using our air quotes again, let's look at our successful Stuart Queen Consorts, such as Anna of Denmark and Henrietta Maria, who produce the heir and carry on the line. Where did they figure in the telling of their royal children's stories in heritage? Because we talk about Charles I and we talk about James I. Where does Anna fit into our telling of the story?
So it's really kind of interesting, and this kind of links back to some of the things I was saying a second ago. But essentially, in a lot of the older interpretation texts, so the interpretation text that's permanent, has been at a site for a really long time, could have been created 20, 30 years ago, she's just completely missing, which is just absolutely horrific. So kind of the best example, best again in a bad way, Stirling Castle, wonderful site, wonderful things. They've done great work kind of with the slightly earlier Stuart stuff and reconstructing the building, wonderful. But the interpretation for kind of the birth of Prince Henry, so Anna and James's first son, at that site, is all about James. It's all about the male line producing a idealized prince who doesn't even become king because he dies. But it's all about the men, and Anna of Denmark is not mentioned by name once in the interpretation. So there's a nice little quote from a contemporary person who was there, and they obviously just call her the Queen, and so she just kind of gets reduced to this nameless queen within the site as a whole, which is shocking because James commissioned a whole new chapel royal at Stirling to christen Henry in, and then they had like a big kind of ceremony and like party afterwards, and they waited. They didn't kind of baptize him straight away because they wanted certain people to be able to come from Denmark and from England to represent those kind of different connections. So Anna was present. A lot of times the Queen isn't present because she's still kind of in those moments post-birth, but she was present at those celebrations. And there's this amazing ship that they kind of constructed for the celebration. And that is an entire kind of, the whole point of the ship is that it links to James's journey to collect Anna and bring her back to Scotland. So that whole thing is all about Anna of Denmark, and she is not mentioned once in that interpretation.
Wow.
She's either just the queen or just not there. And I will talk a little bit more probably later about the new National Portrait Gallery, and they've done a really good job in some areas. You know, they've really focused on the decolonisation and things. But in the Stuart women's section, the sons and the other children are still just referred to as whoever, like son of James the Sixth and First, and you're like, no, where is Anna in this? And even on Anna's portrait, she's only referred to as the daughter of her father. And so there's just this constant removal of these royal women in those spaces. And because a lot of kind of the interpretation of that period in heritage focuses on the monarchy, if we're removing those women, we are losing all our women. So yeah, she's completely kind of taken out of it, which is really interesting because then her daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, is in it as a mother all the time, because it's through her that George I comes to the throne as the first Hanoverian, and so she's the connection kind of between the Stuarts and the present monarchy. So she gets celebrated all the time as a mother, and almost reduced to only being kind of a mother, but at least you know her name, whereas Anna kind of just disappears off somewhere.
She's done her job. Off you pop. Yeah. It's incredible. She's one of those women that I just want to know more about, and shout out to our friend Stephen Virapen, who really told her story so wonderfully in his book on James I, The Wisest Fool. And it seems that those two had a real partnership. It wasn't, for all that James was in no ways a faithful husband, and at this point, nobody expects royal husbands to be faithful. Sorry if that spoils anybody's illusions. Nobody expected them to be faithful to their wives. But she seems to have been a real force to be reckoned with. She was strong and powerful, and she dealt with so much. And the danger of coming across from Denmark and the journey from Scotland to England. She's quite a woman. We need to.
Oh yeah, she's amazing. She's so Stephen obviously has done a great job, and then Gemma Field has done a great job, and there is also I don't know quite when, but there is a new biography coming out of her, hopefully fairly soon. And I'm so excited for that, because we're finally seeing kind of people engaging with Anna of Denmark in a way that isn't just, cool, she had some children, she had a bad relationship with James, end of conversation. Because they were, as you say, much more of a partnership, and she had talents and interests that he could recognize were useful to them as a monarchy, and that, were utilized, and that she did. And the same kind of goes for her confessional identity, that there were aspects of when, and people are still arguing over whether she did convert to Catholicism or not, but her probable conversion to Catholicism, James then could use aspects of that politically, and I think that's kind of another thing that will be fascinating to kind of see develop in research over the next few years.
That's interesting. So you've led us very neatly on to the next thing I want to discuss, because, of course, for Anna of Denmark, she very much had to be seen outwardly as a Protestant in order to come and take the English throne with her husband. He was very, very careful and very canny. He knew that they had to be presented as a Protestant succession. That was important. But the religious practices of some of these Stuart queens, they're often controversial. How is that reflected in heritage sites?
Yeah, so it's actually really weird in that essentially for most heritage sites, it's not represented at all. And I think some of this is like a fear that as a country that is kind of officially Protestant, that we don't want to talk about these Catholic women, or like a fear that, well, if we're going to talk about it, then we have to put lots of context in, and then we have to talk about conflict. And they don't want to talk about conflict in the kind of realm of a, again, quote unquote, successful kind of early modern monarchy. And a lot of that, I think, again, is related to the fact that we still have a monarchy. I think it affects it hugely. And a lot is made of how Catherine and Henrietta Maria both have kind of these stipulations in their marriage negotiations that they're going to be allowed to carry on worshipping Catholicism. And a lot of people make a really big deal out of this. And obviously it did have kind of a lot of repercussions for them because Catholicism was so different to Protestantism. But Anna also has the same stipulations in her marriage contract. So when she marries James, she's coming from Denmark, and she's Lutheran, and she comes over and they agree that she is still going to have the right to worship in that way and that she isn't going to be expected to worship as part of the Church of Scotland. So there's already a precedent for that. It's just that she's still seen as Protestant, and the other two are Catholic, and that's kind of where the division comes. But so much is made of that happening for the later two, and you think, well, actually it was already happening. And yeah, for Anna, in Heritage, I think some of the kind of not discussing her confessional identity is about that, we still know the debate is happening, and so we don't want to commit ourselves to something on a label because that label might last 20 years, and we will kind of want to future-proof it and not talk about it. But by excluding their confessional identity, we're excluding a huge part of their agency and their self-expression, and an opportunity to discuss not only conflict meaningfully, but also the importance of political and diplomatic relations with other parts of Europe that were other religions. So yeah, it's often very oversimplified, and it doesn't need to be.
Exactly. And also, I mean, you by not reflecting that and not talking about it, you take away a massive part of their agency, because Catherine of Braganza was so aware of her marriage contract. And she, I mean, I imagine her keeping that in her skirts sort of the whole time that she was married. She was not going to be, I can't think of any better way to say it. She wasn't going to be dicked around. She knew what she was entitled to. She knew she was entitled to practice. And the fact that that this leads to something as awful as the Popish plot, which I stand by being like the QAnon of its time. It was so bonkers and so widespread and so disruptive and upsetting. All because of her Catholicism, which she was entitled to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's always one of the things. So, like, if we were thinking modern day, would you expect someone to give up their religion because they were getting married to one particular person? And the answer for most of us is no, we would not. And I think, that is really interesting, because actually the only time Catherine's confessional identity does come into heritage sites is if they're very briefly discussing the Popish plot. And it's always done quite briefly. It's never kind of in a lot of detail. But that's the only time that she really gets her confessional identity discussed at all. And obviously it's in a really negative and, as you say, totally bizarre and crazy situation. And the only other time that I've really seen Henrietta Maria's confessional identity explored was in, did you go to the Charles I King Collector exhibition?
Twice. I loved it.
Amazing. So I basically went 3 times and wrote a million notes.
Amazing.
And the art was amazing. That was fabulous. The stuff that was on display was fantastic. Yeah. But Henrietta Maria had her own room, and they called it the Queen's House, which is kind of what we now call the house that she lived in Greenwich, and they had some of her art on the wall, and it was really, it was fine, but they never mentioned her in relation to some of the other portraits in the previous rooms. And this kind of, to me, really suggested that it was like, well, here's Henrietta Maria's little Catholic little hideout, and here is all the stuff, and she only patronizes Italian Catholic artists, whereas in the room before there was all these amazing family portraits, and they were all talked about as Charles I, as belonging to him, as being about him, when in reality Henrietta Maria commissioned some of them. She would have sat for them. She had other versions of those paintings made and sent them to her sisters, who were queens in other parts of Europe, and so to me that really, they were trying to be look at her Catholicism and her agency, which was great. But what actually happened was it being well, this is just her, and she's not connected to her family or her English subjects in any way. She's completely other. She's completely different. And it was like, well, yes, she was interested in these things, but then Charles also became interested in those things because his wife introduced them to him, and she had to act as like a conduit for that passage of some of those artworks to Charles, because a Catholic state couldn't send them to him as a Protestant king, so they would send them to him via her, and so it sort of didn't do a good job of explaining that actually it's much, the kind of royal patronage at the time was much more fluid than kind of it was being portrayed. So that was the only time that her her confessional identity was really on display, and it didn't feel like they got it quite right. The art was amazing, but
God love them for trying, though.
Yeah.
And this is the thing with heritage. You know, we are constantly reviewing how we're presenting our history and our heritage sites, and like you say, it needs to evolve, and it evolves with generations, and it evolves with talking to experts who've thought about it like you have. So we're going to get on to a hot topic in heritage, and we're going to talk about colonies and empires. Now, Catherine of Braganza brought various trading outposts to Charles II as part of her dowry. She came from Portugal, for anyone who hasn't listened to Eilish's episode, and you must do that. We'll put some links up for it. So Bombay, for example, that's one of the things that comes over with Catherine, and it proves a very useful place to possess. So how can heritage sites reconcile the part that Catherine played in founding the British Empire? I know she's often credited with it. And how do we feel about it at this moment, at this time of recording?
Yeah, so as you say, obviously this is kind of like the hot topic at the moment. How do we decolonize our heritage sites? How do we kind of engage with those narratives that are so important? We need to engage with them. And Catherine's dowry included, as you say, Bombay, which is now Mumbai, and also Tangier, and kind of various trading agreements and other things. And she's also remembered for popularizing tea in England, which is fundamentally linked to colonialism and expansion. So it's really interesting to look at how Catherine is represented currently in heritage sites in relation to this. So there's some very old interpretation at Edinburgh Castle in one of their regimental museums, which really celebrates her for being this queen of empire, because their regiment went to Tangier, and that was their first battle honour. So it does this whole thing about Catherine brought Tangier, and then however many years later, like that was the regiment's first battle honour, and blah blah, and really kind of celebrates the expansion of empire. And it is a very old piece of interpretation, and you know, like you can see that maybe we wouldn't write it the way it is written now, but that one was really interesting because it made me kind of think that Catherine is where she can't be the wife, the mother of children. She is the mother of an empire, and that's kind of where she gets to keep a little position in the English historic narrative, which is really interesting. And obviously now we're probably going to start approaching that in a different way. And in terms of just the decolonization of the monarchy in this period in general, it's really interesting because so there was another temporary exhibition, Tudors to Windsor's British Royal Portraits. I don't know if you got to that one. It was at Greenwich, so it was in the National Maritime Museum, and they did a little bit of colonization of some of the portraits, and when they were doing that, they were only doing it on people who didn't lead directly to the modern monarchy, and were deemed as unsuccessful, and in most cases were Catholic. So they talked about it a lot for James VII and II, and then they also briefly mentioned it for like some of the Catholic mistresses, and other than that, no one else got decolonized, including Catherine, which was really interesting. And some of that can also be seen that for a long time, colonialism and empire was seen as a masculine thing, and it was assumed that women couldn't be involved in it. And because of that, a lot of kind of heritage sites won't explore women within that theme. So it's sort of like, yeah, we can decolonize the men, but they weren't decolonizing the women to the same extent. But it's really interesting that everyone who was decolonized in that space was Catholic, because that goes back to that well, now we're Protestant, so we can't kind of we can't present a negative image of Protestantism in the early modern period, but we can of Catholicism, because that's fine, because the modern monarchy and the kind of national religion is not Catholicism. So as I said earlier, the National Portrait Gallery in London has really tried to decolonise their narrative. And so they've reopened in the summer after kind of 3 years of massive renovations. Sorry, I can't speak today. And they talk about both Charles II and James, and discuss them in terms of empire and colonialism. But what's really weird is that they own one of the most amazing portraits of Catherine, and they've not put it in the gallery. And it would actually be a great portrait to explore her dowry through, because it's the portrait that was probably painted just before her marriage. So that would have been an amazing painting to include and to discuss queenship and colonialism. But in general, they have kind of done a better job of unpicking it than before. And so, it's really interesting, because these queen consorts are barely, as we said, represented at all. And we want to represent them as kind of full people. But at the same time, they are all kind of connected to colonialism and empire, and we do need to recognise that, and we do need to discuss that. And there are plenty of objects that we can discuss it through. So I think it's about how we kind of approach putting some of those objects in those spaces.
Now we have that conversation. Actually, it's interesting. While I've got you here, could you define decolonizing someone? How do we decolonize somebody? Because it's a word that we sort of read a lot, and I'm thinking, if we sort of we're reading it and we're sort of getting it by context, but can you define it? What does that mean?
Yeah. So interestingly, decolonize used to mean, and still means if you're discussing it in certain historical contexts, something completely different. It basically means when the empire started to collapse and kind of British people in those other kind of places were coming back, and were kind of destroying evidence and all those sorts of things. So that's kind of one meaning of the word. And then when we're talking about it in terms of education and heritage and all those sorts of things, what we're really talking about is looking at how we're presenting historical narratives and looking at how we've completely either ignored or misrepresented kind of the history of empire and colonialism, and how we need to approach that in a new way, and to unpick those narratives. So that earlier kind of example of Catherine in the Regimental Museum is a really good example of how at one point in time, kind of the prevailing attitude in Britain would have been to kind of celebrate her and to celebrate that connection. Whereas now we recognise that actually all of that was connected to the enslavement of thousands of people, and that led to kind of horrific things, and that we need to be discussing that and recognising that. And it gets a lot of people on both sides very fired up and very upset. And there's this feeling from kind of the anti-decolonization side that it's that it's an attack on English culture or on kind of people's national identity, and it's not. That's not what it's trying to do. It's trying to provide us with a fuller understanding of history and of what has been happening, and to help us kind of understand how we've got to where we are now. It's really important, and I think museums are definitely, even in kind of the last kind of few years, last year's Museums Association conference focused on it, and people are working on it amazingly. But with all things, as I said earlier, it's going to take funding and it's going to take time, and it's very easy, again, for people on both sides to get very upset and worried when maybe there isn't, it hasn't happened yet. There's a plan or there's a discussion and nobody's sure what that's going to look like. And it's very complex and difficult, but it's definitely something we should be doing.
It's complex, it's difficult, but it's exciting. And let's face it, if history is not making you slightly uncomfortable and a bit on edge, you're just not doing it right.
No, exactly. Yeah, we need to be uncomfortable, and we need to recognise what actually happened.
You've got to think. It's got to make you think. It's got to be thought provoking, because by having those conversations can we make ourselves better in future generations. And we stand by that here at History Hack. So we touched on national identity. Yes, this is important. So do you think the national identity of the heritage sites themselves and the historical associations that manage them, so whether we're looking at a castle in England, whether we're looking at a castle in Scotland, do you think this has affected how they represent their Stuart Queens Consort, such as Catherine? You know, they're not English, they're not British. Why would anyone want their face on a tea towel? Do you think it affects that they're not
100%? And I think the thing that kind of we should remember when we're talking about the monarchy and representations of the monarchy, as we kind of touched on earlier, is the importance of inheritance and of kind of longevity and legitimacy. And that's really enforced by the fact that we have a modern monarchy and that we're still kind of moving to a point, as opposed to moving to a point that no longer exists. So those themes still are really important. And there's a really strange kind of approach to the national identity of these people that is like, oh, well, if the father's English or Scottish, well, then obviously the child is English or Scottish. And you're like, well, actually, Charles I was like half Danish and had huge amounts of communication with his Danish family. Like Anna's brothers came to visit Scotland and England. You know, him and his brother knew these people. They were not abstract, far away kind of family connections. And Anna was really really in contact with her kind of family all over kind of Europe, and very proud of that, and very very aware of that. And it just kind of gets reduced that, well, as long as you're the son of an English or the daughter of an English or a Scottish monarch, well, then you're English or Scottish. And a national identity, national and personal, is so much more complicated than that. And so, yeah, it's quite strange. Everybody kind of gets reformed into the perfect English or the perfect British monarch or child, when in reality, that's not really what was going on. And in terms of the national identity of the heritage sites themselves, what's really interesting with the difference between the English and the Scottish ones, so if you're looking at, say, sites in London to sites in Edinburgh, especially with James VI and First, a lot of scholarship around him is very kind of written from an Anglo-centric perspective. And so you go there and you can see the Scottish interpretation in the heritage sites reacting against that kind of English superiority that is presented in the kind of older historiography. And you can see them kind of reasserting Scotland and reasserting Edinburgh and James as important kind of cultural patrons, and as kind of Anne Mary, Queen of Scots, as Renaissance monarchs. And they really make a point of that being a Scottish thing. And you can see that kind of tension between between the two representations. And with James, it is most clearly seen in most English sites will call him James I. He's not James I, he's James VI and First. And in Scotland, he will always either be James VI or he'll be James VI and First. And the regnal numbers really make a difference, and you can really see it. And if anybody's kind of been to the Queen's Galleries, so there's one attached to Buckingham Palace and there's one attached to Holyrood House. They put the same exhibitions on in those spaces, but one of them is slightly smaller, the Scottish one is slightly smaller, and they edit kind of some of the text before it goes out. And it's really fascinating if you want to go to a Stuart exhibition, go to one in London and then go to the one in Edinburgh, because there will be a difference, even down to the audio guide being read in a kind of Scottish accent in comparison to a Queen's English accent, if you're in the London version. And it's just fascinating how much kind of that sense of identity comes into play in those sites.
No, I think it's wonderful. There's a part of me that when I'm up in Scotland at heritage sites, it's like coming home, because they really have. It feels like they are reclaiming their Stuart monarchy, and the fact that it is far older than our Stuart monarchy here in England. It's it's a long and sort of difficult relationship that we've got, but it's I really enjoy it when I'm up there. I enjoy how they present it. But it's even things like going up there as an English person and someone who has been through the English schooling system and of British history. The fact that I had never considered until last year at Stirling Castle that Elizabeth II was their Elizabeth I. It had never even crossed my tiny mind that, of course, Elizabeth I was Elizabeth I of England. She wasn't involved. She didn't represent Scotland in any way. So, of course, when we have Elizabeth II, they're like, hang on, we haven't had one before. We've only had, and people blew up post boxes.
There was, people went, there was protests, there was kind of people like sending petitions in saying we should be referring to her as Elizabeth I here. And that is something I actually talk about in the kind of my thesis conclusion, is talking about how important James's regnal numbers are, and how I've spoken to some members of the English academic community who kind of go, oh, well, it's not that important. He's James I, isn't he? Because that was his more important kind of title. And you're like, no, like he had a whole Scottish reign before that. And if we take out the 6th, then we are ignoring that part of his reign. But then clearly it is still so important, because in 1953, that was still the attitude to Elizabeth as a queen. Like that was still so important. And that's been so interesting doing this study at a point when by the end of it, we were in the context of monarchical death and succession, because so much material was being produced in so many different ways then, that especially because Charles III's name kind of links back to Charles I and Charles II, there was so much discussion around that, and so many kind of little things that, being my area, kind of like, I thought, oh, look at that. So even the Queen's last portrait for her last Jubilee, she's sitting in Windsor Castle, and there's a window, and there's a blurred, like it's kind of blurry out the window, but the statue that you can see blurred out behind the window is of Charles II. And to me, that is completely purposeful. That is a completely purposeful, here is a king who was restored, we continued having the monarchy. Like, here is a point where we could see the disintegration of the monarchy, so we're going to try to make this as smooth as possible. And in terms of how many, we've had a lot of Stuart representations in temporary heritage sites over the last 5 or 6 years, and all of them have been made in the knowledge that the Queen was getting older and that there's the inevitable death and succession. So I think that's fascinating.
Wonderful. It's been incredible to watch. It's as a royal watcher, it's just been absolutely amazing to watch. But this is the thing with history and heritage and how things change and how things evolve. We could come to a point where in 20, 30, 50 years, and further into the future, we may have history books where Elizabeth is referred to as Elizabeth II and first.
Yeah.
Because especially if Scotland becomes independent and wants to review how history is taught and how history is written, that would be I could see that absolutely happening, that she would be referred to by dual titles. But I think this is you and me sitting down with a glass of wine, and we could talk all day. I'm conscious of time, so we will start wrapping up. Let's just have one more point on Catherine of Braganza, because we want to talk about her here. She was a patron of the arts. She loved art as well, and tea, obviously. There must be so many opportunities for heritage sites to bring her in. How would you do it if you're in charge? How do you get Catherine in places?
I've actually mostly thought of this from kind of the parenthood perspective. I would love an exhibition on like medieval and early modern women, pregnancy and parenthood, and I would love it to be a co-collaboration with kind of charities and stuff, with other people like modern artists or just members of the community who have experienced those things then responding in a variety of creative ways to those paintings and those narratives and those things sitting side by side. I'd absolutely love that. For Catherine, I think it would be absolutely fascinating if we had an exhibition that brought together all of the things that we have about her and then all of the things that are in Portugal about her, because what Eilish kind of mentioned, I think in the last podcast, is that she returns to Portugal. She is a regent. She's a Queen Regent of Portugal. And I went to Lisbon last year and I mentioned her to just a shop person that I was like buying something off, having a chat with. And she said, "Oh, because she's our queen and your queen." And that was a fascinating interaction. And there's statues of Catherine and discussions of Catherine and tea in Portugal that obviously all linked to colonialism again, and kind of how was that being kind of approached in the kind of early 90s. And I think that would be fantastic to bring all that together and create a really well-rounded exhibition about her, and one that didn't shy away from decolonizing her, but also made sure that we weren't placing her in this really bad position because she didn't have children. I think there's so much we could do.
I would go to that exhibition, but on my previous point about you and I getting a glass of wine, I think it's us getting a glass of wine in Lisbon.
Yeah,
I think this is where we start this.
I've got the perfect little place we can sit overlooking the water. It's great.
This sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and joining me today, Amy. Where can we follow you and follow your work?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Amy E. Saunders. And from there I've got kind of a link into all my talks and things like that. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Excellent. Good stuff. Keep up the good work and let's get the Stuart Queens back into things. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Charly.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.